Okay, I think the mic's working great. Well, thank you so much for joining us this morning, and for those that are online, it will be the afternoon because there are panelists and also people joining us from Asia and Africa, as well as other parts of the world. So it's great to see so many faces here. I think a number of us all know one another, so it's good to see new faces as well as traditional faces. Now, today's discussion, as you can see from the title, is how different partnership models supported the response against COVID-19. And we want to look at, how innovation happened, how we worked together as partners, and how we were able to make that unprecedented surge in manufacturing in response to the pandemic. Now, what we're going to do before we go into the speakers and the panel, we've got a short 2-minute video for you to watch, and it's a glimpse of our new digital campaign called Always Innovating. So I'll hand over to our technicians just to run that now.
Where does hope come from? For patients around the world, hope can start with a new idea, like this one, or this one. There are lots of brilliant ideas, but developing new medicines or vaccines is not that simple. It's a risky, unpredictable journey. There are false starts, dead ends, ups and downs. Some ideas progress for years, but still fail. Some head off in unexpected new directions. Many build on scientific discoveries from across the decades. But from thousands of ideas, only a handful will succeed. So the ones that are going to make it are going to need a lot of help and collaboration along the way. From initial lab testing, to discover a formulation that could work, to clinical trials, where thousands of people volunteer to ensure safety and efficacy, through to analyzing scientific data so regulators can make a decision, and on to state-of-the-art facilities where ideas are turned into high-quality medicines and vaccines. This path isn't easy. It takes time, scientific ingenuity, and investment. But the journey is important. These ideas transform into new ways to prevent, treat, or cure disease, and give hope to people everywhere.
Well, as we saw, innovation's not simple, has its ups, has its downs, has its failures. It needs collaboration, it needs investment, it needs time. So in the case of COVID, we didn't have very much time. And the importance here is how did those partnerships work and able to result in that unprecedented surge in manufacturing that we saw and in delivery of COVID vaccines. Now, I think one thing I just want to stress is we shouldn't forget, because it's almost like a number of, we're forgetting that the pandemic was there, it's in our minds, but we shouldn't forget the immense challenge that many of us went through, and many in companies in particular, as well as regulators and other partners did, in response to the pandemic. A lot of personal input that was put in there, from dealing with issues like raw material supplies, components, manufacturing, finding the right partners, regulatory approval, and all of that, remember, was done in lockdown. So we're going to hear a number of these stories from the panelists. But before we do that, I'm going to invite 4 speakers who are going to provide their viewpoints on the challenge and on the issue of responding to the pandemic and future pandemics. Marco Alaman, who is the Assistant Director General of WIPO, Anthony Torban, who's the Director of Intellectual Property Division at WTO Secretariat, and Thomas Queenie, who is our Director General, as well as an interesting presentation from Rasmus Beck Hansen, who is the CEO and founder of Affinity. So I will ask now Marco to come and deliver his presentation. Thank you, Marco.
Greg, many thanks for the kind introduction. Thomas, pleasure to be here. Friends, happy to be here today with you. I have a very short presentation as an introduction to this event. Let me be brief because we have very limited time allocated for this. The COVID crisis prompted responses to find solutions urgently from all actors of the innovation ecosystem: governments, private sector, research institutions, universities, international community, non-governmental organizations, even a very key role of philanthropic foundations. All of those actors get together to find an urgent solution for the COVID-19 pandemic. And both governments and private sector redirected efforts, and in particular financial and human efforts, to get a solution in record time. The scale of the pandemic, without any doubt, created a great deal of interest for the private sector. So that's clearly explained the huge mobilization of private actors. But at the same time, the urgent mobilization of governments to be sure that a solution can be found. And in this case, you have two interests there: the social return interest, the social interest, and the private interest and the private return interest. What we have conducted in WAPO a study in 2022 that shows that the social benefit of the vaccine innovation amounts to 70.5 trillion globally, while the benefit of the vaccine innovation amounts to about 70.5 billion to the research companies. So if we take a calculation, the social benefit is about 887 times the benefit of private actor. When you have these both interests aligned, social interest and private interest, public intervention is less in need. Something we have done in WAPO in order to provide data that can be analyzed about the situation. Something that we have done is the publication of a landscaping report in the year 2023 that COVID data from January 20 to September 2022. This data analyzed about 800 patents, shows about 1,300 were for vaccines and about 5,000 were for therapeutics. And the distribution is almost even in between research institutions and private actors. It means companies. So if we take that into account, let's then talk about collaboration. That is the subject that brings all of us here today. Regarding collaboration, let me tell you the following. 1/4 of the COVID-19 patent application had multiple assay needs, indicating huge collaboration among companies, research organization, and great collaboration between both pharmaceutical company, biotech startups, and universities. Many of that collaboration took place in vaccine development. Let's start with this reference to vaccine development, where not only the collaboration took place between university or research institutions themselves, but also between universities, research institutions, and companies, as well as between companies themselves. I took 5 examples here. And in the 5 examples that I'm showing in the figure, there are collaboration between different Chinese companies and research institutions. And one example, the one on the in the middle top row, that refers to collaboration between French research institutions and 2 French companies. So related to vaccine development, what we can see here is that they have been a very strong collaboration, and a good proxy for that, for the measure of that collaboration, is the number of co-owned patent applications and patent granted. And when you get together to the point to co-own the application or co-own the final decision taken. It means the granting of the patent. Certainly, that's required great level of maturity and understanding between the different actors, and is an excellent example of collaboration. In the case of therapeutics, most collaboration were between universities and research institutions. This network analysis show mainly 4 communities of collaboration. The US European group that centered around universities and research institutions from the United States and Europe. The second one is the French group, centered around the research institution like CNRS and ICERN, that is seen in the right-hand side of the slide. The other group is the Korean group, centered around research institution from South Korea. And finally, the Chinese group, primarily composed of corporate entities and research institutions from China, as seen on the bottom right-hand side of the slide. So great collaboration also taking place in the field of therapeutic. Our research also show that funding, purchasing, licensing, and research and development collaboration agreements for COVID-related vaccine, diagnostic, and drugs took place among global governments, industries, and organizations. You will see here the contribution in those agreements, either from government, from industry, from funder, or from international organization. And you will see the different types of agreement, either supply agreement, either a research and development licensing agreement. And it is clearly indicated here that huge interaction took place. Keeping in mind that, on my limited of time, let me focus on 2 more things. We anticipate in the organization that because these more active engagement in between different actors, many of those well-known among them, but other new actors in this scene of collaboration, probably more disputes will arise. And we put in place in the Arbitration and Mediation Center a new service related to disputes in the life science, but also keeping in mind the interest of tech transfer agreements and the interest to scale up and produce in the region. We tailor-made a new service through the expert determination rules to help parties that probably have not done business before to get together and negotiate agreement through the help of this expert that in the middle will help this to take place. We have been working also with different countries all over the world in making sure that every actor, including research institutions and governments, are well equipped to go ahead in negotiations of different licensing agreements. I'm sure that there is clarity that innovation was key, and there is also clarity that IP plays a key important role. The question is, we that know now after COVID-19, the challenges faced by different innovators actors in that in this occasion, whether we are happy, whether the innovation, with the way the innovation system work and the way the IP system work, or whether we are even more convinced that more needs to be done to be sure that what we put in place in terms of innovation ecosystem and what we put in place in terms of IP will continue to work properly to be sure that for future pandemics, we are better equipped than we were on this occasion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Marco, for emphasizing the importance, I think, of what is global collaboration, and also the importance, as we heard, about the framework for innovation, including the importance of IP. If I can ask Tony now to take the podium.
Thank you very much, Greg and Thomas. And wonderful to be with you all and to see some excellent friends who've done so much to progress these kind of partnerships throughout this critical period. And I bring, of course, greetings from my boss, Dr. Ngozi, who was unable to be here today, as well as my other boss, DDG and Annabelle Gonzalez. So it's an honor, for that reason, an honor for me to join you today. So looking at the theme of how different partnerships supported the response against COVID. I think for us in the WTO Secretariat, we saw a kind of a journey as the peak of the pandemic response ran from the initial general calls for moving beyond business as usual, finding new ways of working together to tackle the pandemic, to, for us, really the path-breaking consensus outcomes at the ministerial conference last year. And there were multiple layers of partnerships that took us there. I'd like to briefly review a number of these, sort of roughly working from the micro to the macro, as it were. Although there's absolutely nothing micro about the partnerships in form of licensing deals that delivered remarkable new vaccine technologies with unprecedented rapidity and extraordinary volumes as the pandemic response developed. It's sometimes forgotten, for instance, that an mRNA vaccine is itself the product of a partnership between an SME and a global established pharmaceutical player. The kind of partnerships that are the inputs into these finished products need to be understood from a policy point of view and of course encouraged. And here I think Marco's presentation just now has helped us understand what the IP, the patent data in particular, and the licensing information can tell us about the diversity and range of these partnerships that are so important and that we need to learn from. Indeed, I think one of the critical areas of policy learning from the appalling experience of the pandemic is to understand the practicalities of voluntary licensing and the policy tools that support and promote such technological partnerships, because a voluntary license is, after all, a technological partnership. One way of informing this vital process of learning the hard lessons from the pandemic would be to look more systematically at the patterns of this form of technological partnership. Broadly, the detailed granular data in this area are less clear, less tractable than obviously the patent data, which is more easy to work with. And here I would note that WIPO's work in this area in particular is extremely valuable, as is the work of the WHO in elaborating the CTAP licensing model and other initiatives, notably the Medicines Patent Pool. These are important in themselves, but they're also important sources of learning and information that we need to draw together. It's notable that one point of information you may know, a difficult conversation in the TRIPS Council in the WTO concerning COVID and the COVID response. One area that we were asked as a Secretariat to provide to members was greater information updates on patterns of vaccine licensing. And it's a reminder that at the policy level, there's strong interest in this area. We did find that there's a great diversity of licensing practices that at least we could discern from the publicly available data. But it would be illuminating to hear more from those involved, those who actually do this for a living, so that we have a better understanding of the concrete factors that led to such diverse approaches. And indeed, this is my cue to advertise a trilateral webinar next week on this exact theme. And it's part of this idea that understanding the practicalities of licensing, I think, is one of the areas where the policy debate needs to be informed and enriched. And this gives me a segue to another form of partnership at the policy level, but also at the practical level, that's exemplified by the trilateral program of cooperation established between the WHO, WIPO, and the WTO, which was consciously strengthened by the three Directors General at the height of the pandemic. This collaborative partnership, which is what it is, has long been based on a fundamental principle, but one that was very much put to test in the pandemic, when the logic of this trilateral approach was borne out in the most demanding, most difficult circumstances. That principle is the understanding that the policy drivers that enable innovation and equitable access are complex, inherently complex, and interrelated, and that the public health, the trade, the intellectual property aspects cannot fruitfully be analysed or implemented in isolation from one another, and that technical assistance and policy support in each of these areas must be delivered in an integrated way, rather than looking at specific areas in isolation from one another. And I think these insights were borne out in practice when we saw the impact from a trade point of view of trade policy settings, firstly in relation to PPE, and then most critically as the rollout of vaccines progressed. Dispersed production and supply chains are themselves important, vital forms of partnerships that form the foundation for more equitable and more adaptive access now, and sustained resilience in the future. I think one of the strong policy interests that many of our member governments have stressed. Interestingly, our monitoring in the WTO of COVID trade policy interventions did see an early focus on protectionist measures, perhaps at one level an understandable early instinct, but this quickly turned towards a trend towards an opening as the negative effects of trade restrictions became clear, as indeed the self-damage of trade restrictions became clear. One partnership on that note that we've been able to build, in part as a response to the pandemic, has been to work even more intensively with trade policy experts and statisticians, and to bring in a public health dimension into that work, so as to develop policy insights and statistical tools to support the greater integration of the trade policy dimension into the concerns about access to medicines and access to critical inputs to medicines production. We've been able to develop more granular data. My hardworking colleagues, I can't take credit for it, we've been able to develop more granular data and use this as a foundation for more grounded policy analysis. And we'd like to put this to the service of the international community as the basis for really embedding the understandings of we learned from the unfortunate hard lessons of the pandemic. So put more simply, the principles of an agreement such as the Trade Facilitation Agreement, a classic trade agreement in the WTO, these are not just about promoting trade in a narrow economic sense. In a context when virtually all countries are and will likely remain largely dependent on imports for both critical inputs and for many finished products, a trade facilitation agreement is itself an access to medicines agreement. As we see an understandable sense of urgency to progress to more dispersed production capacity, the partnerships, the public and private sector partnerships that establish such capacity are enabled and made more feasible by open supply chains. The pandemic has, in a sense, been a stress test for the core principles of the multilateral trading system. And we've learned that it can be ultimately self-defeating to close down or restrict complex production and supply chains. Ironically, these have proven to be even more important at a time of urgent and unpredictably evolving demand. Looking more widely, some of the critical partnerships that came into focus was the attention to enhanced regulatory cooperation as a form of partnership, and increased attention to procurement policy, especially the potential of pooled procurement partnerships, ideally on a regional model, one of the ideas that is, I think, gathering some pace and some interest. There's a regulatory dimension to these initiatives, a reminder that failure to cooperate, collaborate, work towards convergence on the regulatory front is itself an obstacle to timely and affordable, equitable access. An approach to pooled procurement, for example, on a regional basis, would also provide effective leverage, economies of scale, and contribute to longer-term sustainability. Another form of partnership that came up, especially in, I'm running out of time, that relates especially to, that really came from, in particular, Dr. Ngosi's conversations with CEOs at the height of the pandemic. And this is the challenge of mapping supply and demand. The challenges of matching supply and demand at a volatile period was one of those areas that the industry repeatedly mentioned to us at the height of the pandemic. This is one area of future partnership that our members actually drew attention to in the Ministerial Declaration on Pandemic Preparedness. While exactly how you would work on this. It's clearly an area for really very valuable future partnership. I would conclude just by mentioning given my job title, Director of the IP Division, the elephant, maybe not in this room, but the elephant in the conference room, that is that of IP. Just a reminder that IP is itself a means of structuring and enabling partnerships. One of the very links that form these dispersed production and supply chains, the very packages of technological enablement that are essential for technology transfer. So here we're reminded in our agreement, the TRIPS agreement, that the IP system is meant to work in a sense as in itself a kind of public-private partnership. That is to say, promoting the mutual advantage of the producers and the users of technological knowledge, and indeed promoting social and economic welfare. And so I would leave just with a plea to consider. I know what's been controversial particularly for the industry community, the ministerial declaration on TRIPS and ministerial declaration on TRIPS from last year, but a reminder that that has to be seen in its perspective. It is not a waiver of IP. It is a reminder that in that public-private partnership that is the IP system, there are no absolutes, and that there is in many national systems scope for public interest, and that is understanding that, thinking that through. I think is one of the areas of partnership that we do need to have an open conversation about. Finally, I think one of the really rewarding aspects as policy evolves and develops is the increasing partnership between practitioners and policymakers, and the wealth of experience that we have even in Geneva, ranging from product development partnerships to access initiatives. Our work in the WTO was greatly enriched by the very direct practical input from industry leaders. It was incredibly valuable, as well as discussions with civil society and other players, and above all our member governments. That partnership, which is in the form of an open, informed, engaged dialogue, I think is the critical partnership that should take us through to, I hope, a more successful and healthy future, facing with future health crises. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. And you dealt with some points there: regulatory challenges in the supply chain, export issues, IP. A number of these will be taken up not just by Thomas, but also by a panel. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much to Marco and to Tony for the introductory remarks. I must say, I've come to Geneva first about 40 years ago as a young multilateral diplomat for Switzerland, and I've believed in the importance of multilateralism ever since. I think what's really new, and it's always easy with the benefit of hindsight, to talk about what could we have done better? Where do we need to improve next time? And I think probably it's easy to find a consensus that equitable rollout is the one thing where we need to do better next time. But actually, having lived through HIV/AIDS, swine flu, bird flu, and others, Richard Hatchett from ZEPI has once done an analysis and concluded, never before have we seen such a fast rollout, and actually a rollout also to people in developing countries of medical countermeasures as we saw during the COVID pandemic. I must say, when I look back, also, I've never seen this kind of partnerships, unusual partnerships. You know, big pharma companies who had quit vaccine manufacturing many years ago, doing fill and finish for other partners or teaming up on therapeutics. Now, one of the interesting elements, and this is why I was so pleased that both WIPO and WTO agreed to join us for this meeting, is to look at the different models, to look at what worked. We unfortunately don't have time to look into what didn't work that well, and I could actually give a 2-day seminar on, you know, why is it that out of 300 vaccine projects, and I was thinking about that when I looked at Marco's, you know, slides, actually the pattern mapping is just one element, but those who worked were few. and there were even fewer in the treatments. And those who worked were based on, innovation delivering, access to pathogens granted immediately. It was based on, joining forces across the field, academics, big pharma, small pharma, but also international organization. I didn't know Dr. Ngozi until early in the pandemic, because I didn't sit on the Gavi board. When she was appointed special envoy for ACT-A, we were a founding partner of ACT-A together with our colleagues from the Developing Country Vaccine Manufacturers Network. And then she was co-chair of COVAX, where I represented the industry too. And I have to admit, more than once, did we talk to each other, talk about the need to tackle trade barriers, talk about actually what are the challenges in scaling up. And few people fully recall the challenges of trebling global vaccine manufacturing, which was 5 billion doses pre-pandemic for all the vaccines, including, flu vaccines. And in 21, companies manufactured to produce 11 billion. They could have produced 20 billion in 22, but let's say demand this year, we are now in 23, is dropping dramatically. And we see this in the context of the conversations we engage on regional vaccine manufacturing, the need for diversity. Who could challenge that when you look at what happened in Africa when, the supply from India suddenly dropped from, potentially 50 or 100 million doses per month to 0 during 7 months. And let's say the US hadn't opened their borders before every American citizen was vaccinated. Therefore, I think the power of partnership is something which we need to talk about. The thinking out of the box, the willingness to engage. I've made friends with many of the senior people from developing country vaccine manufacturers with the Developing Country Vaccine Manufacturer Network. We were teaming up in COVAX and ACT-A with them on emphasizing the role of the private sector. I've jokingly said to friends from WHO, when I read your MCM kind of platform or your HIPAA platform, we could sit back and be laid back for the future pandemic, because when you read the documents, it reads, in the future, next time, these vaccines, treatments, and tests will be researched, developed, and manufactured by WHO or subcontracted by WHO. And when I say that, I see panic on the faces of my counterparts, because basically, whether it's my developing country vaccine manufacturers or the IGBA, the generic manufacturers, or the innovative, everybody knows the importance of actually motivating, engaging with private sector. We will hear examples today of the pairing, different approaches from different companies. I hopefully will hear about some of the challenges. Raw materials were scarce, intermediary products were scarce. We teamed up with CEPI, WHO, Gavi, and others early on in 21 to address the supply chain problems, to address and call out the trade barriers. And Dr. Ngozi repeated that kind of exercise within WTO. It did lead to the call of the 3 DGs. We fully embrace that. I have lived through 3 years of challenges, occasionally dissent, but 3 years of challenges were basically everybody who sat on the ACT-A, led by the WHO special envoys, led by the conveners of the therapeutic pillars, the vaccine pillars, the health system pillar, the diagnostic pillars, teaming up in partnership with the private sector. Right now, as we talk, the G20 Health Working Group has just finished their work in Hyderabad, and what I got in WhatsApp from the new special envoy of WHO is there seems to be a convergence that actually we already now need to work based on the same inclusive partnership, where you do have private sector sitting around the table, where you do have CSOs sitting around the table, where you work together. And I think one key buzzword, it's not voluntary licensing and tech transfer. The key buzzword, I think, it's trust. I'm sure that one element we will hear from both, whether it's from Stavros Nicolaou, whom I've seen online, or others, is that actually these partnerships often were built on long-standing relationships. They were built on trust existing. And Tony, I dare say they were built on an existing enabling framework, which means mRNA, vaccines came out of 30 years trial and error, by and large commercial failures, which suddenly had a breakthrough, a game changing. But of the many mRNA projects which were in development, just 2 made it. Of the even more therapeutic, 1 in 18 made it, but they made it actually in terms of joining forces, joining hands for one common good, which is improving global health. And I think we need to do that now. We need to look at what didn't work. Why did the inequitable rollout happen? Geographic diversity of manufacturing is one element. And the second element is, the commitment from companies, developing country vaccine manufacturers, innovative companies to say, in the next pandemic, we are willing to put aside part of production for rollout in real time to people who need it, wherever they are. With that, I'm really keen to listen then to the partners and hear about the success factors, happily arranged once meeting on why did some things not work. Thank you very much.
Nice one, Thomas.
Okay, and before we go on to the panel, we're going to listen to Rasmus. You're online. You can hear us. We can't hear you. We can now, I think.
Hello, everyone.
Yeah,
and,
great. Okay.
Can you also see my screen?
No.
Okay, just a second. Should be enabled. Hello, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. Just want to check with the technical part. Does my screen show now?
It's Greg. It's Greg here. The screen shows, but it's too small, so the technicians will have to work on that.
Okay, I will. Conscious of time, I will get started, and we can get the data and the screen fully up. But thank you so much for inviting us to speak today. I'll make it fairly brief. What I wanted to do is to put a bit of data context into this discussion. Just for those of you who don't know Affinity, we are an independent global health analytics company, and we have been responsible for putting out a lot of the data on COVID demand, COVID production, and other areas throughout the pandemic, and I believe have become a trusted source for that. And in general, I think our job and the way we can help in this is to provide really truly independent information, so the discussions are based on facts. I'll talk a little bit about the indicators we've seen on innovation, levels of collaboration we've seen, and then ultimately the outcomes of this. Some of these things have been touched upon, but I think it's always good to see the actual data. If we look at starting with the therapeutic space, as Thomas mentioned, it is remarkable to see the levels of innovation, but also I would say the risk-taking that has taken place. 1 out of 18 treatments made it to the ultimate market that came in from trial, starting out with more than 900 in preclinical. So that is, I think, a very large number of scientific projects that was initiated in a very remarkable short time. We have seen that these treatments have come to market many places, been approved many places, but also it's clear that there are some very big gaps, especially in Africa. This map shows where we have seen WHO recommended COVID treatments, in which countries they have been rolled out. If we look at the vaccine space, it's a similar pattern, I would say, but with slightly less slightly fewer developments, which is not surprising given vaccine space is obviously much smaller, but still only 1 in 5 vaccines from clinical trial made it to market. And I remember in the early days of the pandemic where we were helping governments trying to keep track on all the different vaccine projects around the world. And it was like daily there were new coming to market. And I think we now track in total that there have been 462 preclinical vaccine developments, which is again, a truly astonishing number that would not have been able to happen without collaboration, of course, but also a lot of risk taking. And to me, this indicates that some parts of this innovation system that I think everyone is interested in is actually working quite well. On the vaccines, in the vaccine area, we have seen greater, every country has at least 1 approved vaccine. The rollout is of course more uneven, but I think it's fair to say that the vaccine part has seen bigger global coverage than the therapeutics, at least in the short time frame. If we then move to collaborations, so we have tried to track the number of collaborations that has happened throughout the pandemic, and we have counted 177 total collaborations between various pharma groups. Most of them are in the finished drug part, but they cover all parts of the value chain. It's hard to put. We discussed what does this compare to? Is there any kind of good comparison? We obviously been a long time since we had similar pandemics, so I don't think that's a good proxy. But I would say there is nothing we've seen in the history of life sciences that comes close to this level of collaboration in such a short time span. Also, if we look specifically on the production side, I think it's also very interesting to what we try to map here is like taking all the supply chain announcements and all the manufacturing and try to annotate and structure that. And what we're finding here is pretty much all of the manufacturing announcements involved some kind of collaboration. So this the quick scale up of manufacturing clearly was dependent on close collaboration. Here we have a map of the voluntary license agreements, and as you can see, fairly globally distributed map. In total, 93 voluntary licensing agreement, and the top license locations have been India, China, South Korea, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. So let's say we have high level of innovation, we have high levels of collaboration, but what is the ultimate end goal here? Of course, it is to be able to produce vaccines and therapeutics, scale up that very quickly and be able to produce sufficient number to supply the whole world. What we have, one of the interesting things is that what we saw during the pandemic was that these things happened in parallel. We saw a parallel development of both of treatment and vaccine scale up, as this graph shows. Thomas mentioned briefly some of the numbers on the vaccine part. So, and I think you're all familiar with the extremely high levels of production. But I'll just say, kind of the early days of the pandemic is, of course, where it really matters, as that's where every vaccine saves lives. And here we can see that really quick ramp up that happened from Q2. The supply agreement started in Q2 2020, and then we start having the first to market and really scaling up in Q1 2021, and then it goes really fast. I remember we looked at the numbers week on week and were just really astonished to see the output coming from from the manufacturers at that point. So I think, again, fair to say that, of course, some of that could have happened faster, and hopefully the next pandemic, the industry will be able to move even faster. But it has been a really remarkable scale up, and right now, of course, the problem in the industry, and when we look at our demand and supply, is an oversupply of COVID vaccines. But that's a different discussion. But I think I'll end it there and just thank you very much for the opportunity to share this data.
Well, Rasmus, thanks very much. So so we saw the evidence there. We've heard the speeches. We've heard a lot of the issues and challenges. Now what we're going to hear from people who were active in creating these partnerships, these licensing agreements. So I invite my panel to come up onto the stage. Okay, so I should say, as I said, the bios are all available on the website. So I'm not going to run through them for a question of time. Also, after this, we do have, of course, a network lunch. We are supposed to have a Q&A session, but I think we're running over time. We might have to eat into that. So I'm going to kick off straight away. And it's my pleasure to introduce Julia Spencer, who leads MSD's engagement in Geneva, and Vignesh Shivanath, Director of Business Development Alliance Management with Dr. Reddy's Laboratories. This was a very interesting partnership around molnupiravir. Julia, can you tell us about your partnership with Dr. Reddy's, and particularly how it fitted into your concept of access partnerships and the flexibilities around that and different options?
Absolutely. And thanks to IFPMA for including us in what is a really important discussion. Maybe before we talk about how we partnered with Dr. Reddy's lab, I'll step back and talk about our overall strategy for making sure that our product molnupiravir was available to patients around the world that needed it. And that was really through partnerships throughout the process. In addition to the downstream manufacturing partnerships that we had, we also partnered with Ridgeback Therapeutics on the research and development. So this was a biotech and large pharmaceutical development program that happened very quickly over the course of 2021. And our partnership with Dr. Reddy's was part of a three-pronged strategy that we had to ensure equitable access. That started with the work that we did ourselves in parallel to our clinical development work to scale up our own manufacturing at risk before we started even phase 3 clinical trials, to ensure that we had 10 million doses of our own innovator supply available around the first authorization. We also worked in parallel to establish voluntary bilateral partnerships with 8 generic manufacturers, and also worked with the MPP to establish an agreement that resulted in the issuance of more than 20 sublicenses for around in 10 countries around the world. And then lastly, we worked with global procurement organizations, and the result of that was included about 30% of our original innovator supply, or about 3 million courses, being made available to global procurement bodies like UNICEF, again, around the time of initial authorization, to ensure that there were multiple avenues for equitable access for our product, both through innovator supply as well as through generic supply. And so really kind of drilling down into the agreements that we had with the bilateral licensees, we wanted to keep that number small because we knew that we would have to work closely with the teams, with those manufacturers, given the fact that our product was still in the process of being developed. And so we chose 8 firms that we had a long history with. We knew that they had a history of having WHO pre-qualified facilities. They had a history of providing quality assured products, and they also had a history of working with international procurement bodies. And it was a very, very challenging, it sounds easy now, but it was a very, very challenging set of activities to be doing in parallel with the work that we were doing on the development and the commercialization process. And we're really proud to be presenting today with one of those voluntary licensed partners, Dr. Reddy's, and Vignesh can share more information about what it looked like on his side of the fence in India and the work that we did collaboratively together. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Vignesh.
Vignesh, do let us know, what the factors were needed for you to ensure the successful voluntary partnership. We've heard from Julia, that was about speed, risk, collaboration, and flexibility. Those were like key things. But from your side, Vignesh, what were the key factors?
Hi, and first of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. So I'll just quickly jump onto the response to it. So basically, the key factor for us was early partnership or early engagement from the MSD team that enabled us to also be quick, because we had, and also the tech transfer support that we had received from MSD, because as Julia just mentioned, that this product was still under development, so the data was still to be generated. So this early engagement with the MSD helped us to start manufacturing or start the parallel development as a generic manufacturer. Additionally, we also had a number of innovative clinical regulatory pathway with at least the Indian regulator, where the voluntary license holders or the bilateral voluntary license holders had all come together, and we had done a collaboration clinical trial, because at the time of the partnership, the MSD was still doing the move out trial at that point of time. So all the voluntary license holders were part of India had come together, and we had done a collaborative clinical trial. A lot of things here we had support from the MSD team with respect to drafting of the protocol, the primary endpoint, secondary endpoint, which give it's for like an image of the move out trial, so that the Indian regulator are quite convinced about the global data available. So these two if factors were pretty the driving factors for us in partnership with MSD, and which led to a successful partnership with MSD. Adding on, I think so because of this early partnership, we could also engage with a number of public health institutions. For example, like the Gates Foundation, where we had discussed this them some volume guarantees, where we start manufacturing the product at risk, and we be supply ready as soon as we receive our approval, so that we don't waste a lot of time post approval. So all the bilateral early partnership with MSD engagement with the MSD early on open doors for all these channels of channels of patient access.
Okay, Vignesh, thanks very much. And it was mentioned by Thomas, the importance of trust. And I think you can hear from the discussion here, and Vignesh is nodding his head, that the importance of that trust, working with a trusted partner. And I'm also quite amazed by the speed in which this was operated. And as you said, you still have the drug in development, and you were reaching out to voluntary licenses. So that's great. And the cooperation in India between the various generics on a clinical trial, those are quite interesting lessons learned, I think. So I'm going to move on from that experience. We're going to go over to J&J and Aspen. We're joined by Alicia Daly. She's the head of Government Affairs and Policy, EMA Supply Chain Initiatives, and Stavros Nicolaou is the Senior Executive responsible for Strategic Trade and Development at Aspen. Now, Lisa, it's very interesting. J&J was actually the first company to have a partnership agreement on the African continent. You responded very quickly to that need, and you wanted to manufacture, on a global basis. Can you talk about how your partnership model with Aspen worked, due diligence that you undertook, and the results you felt that came out of that?
Yeah, thanks very much, Greg, and thanks for the opportunity to take part in this panel. I think it's been a journey. I think Julia has explained the journey that Merck had, and I think for us there was something similar. I mean, we assessed almost 100 sites before we chose the final 9 that we worked with, the final partners we worked with, and we needed to ensure that that those that we worked with had that experience, the setup really to produce a vaccine, to produce a biologic material, because that needs to be done to specific biological safety requirements, and that wasn't available in many of the sites that we initially looked at. So we eventually agreed, as I said, on or partnered with 9 locations across the globe, across 4 continents, in India, US, and Europe, and then obviously with Stavros in Aspen in South Africa. And I think that, you know, we had many challenges, I'm sure we'll talk some more about, but when you go from producing in one location to many, you know, you need many different materials and components because you're adjusting that production to suit the type of facility that you're moving into. So we assessed this afterwards, and there were over 600 components and materials that were needed in order to produce across our facilities. And I think it's been mentioned already about the partnerships with government. And we actually worked with DG Grow also, who in fact facilitated us meeting with suppliers to ensure that we could ensure that we could acquire those supplies that were needed. So really then, looking specifically to Aspen, we developed am I making this make noise because I'm...
Was it you?
Sorry.
It's the system, it's not you.
Thank you. But we partnered with Aspen with a manufacturing license and also technology transfer. And that was our initial relationship with all of our manufacturing partners. But with Aspen particularly, this developed eventually at the start of 2022 into a commercial arrangement where Aspen produced Aspen branded product in collaboration with us. So we've had it's been a really excellent partnership, and perhaps Stavros will talk some more in detail to that.
Yes, thanks for that so much, Lisha. I mean, yeah, let's hand over to Stavros. We'll talk about the sustainability issue later, but Stavros, give us your thoughts around how this partnership evolved and eventually into this full technology. So let's remind ourselves, it started with fill and finish, and then moved on to full technology transfer and a full IP transfer for the whole of the continent with Aspen. Stavros, the floor is yours.
Greg and colleagues, good morning, and thanks very much for this opportunity. I think let me just state up front that I usually agree with Thomas. And my disagreement with him is that he is still a young diplomat as he was 40 years ago. So nothing has changed, Thomas. Let me get into the subject matter at hand. Aspen had a very early sense of the magnitude of the COVID pandemic, because we are the world's largest supplier of general anesthetics outside of the United States. And naturally, there was a surge demand for our anesthetics for patients that needed to be ventilated, particularly in continental Europe. So we had a very early sense of what was coming down the line and the magnitude of it. We were an organization that had invested heavily in sterile capabilities and capacities, and by March 2020 had already taken a decision to make available or pivot some of our sterile capacity to try and assist our country, the continent, and the world at large with formulation, fill and finish of vaccines. We looked around at who would be the most appropriate partner. We have a strong track record, and I think R&D Pharma understates this, in working with multinationals in solving the HIV crisis, multi-drug resistant TB with Eli Lilly. So there was a strong track record, but also a blueprint in the form of voluntary licensing and technology transfers that existed already very early on, and for at very least 2 decades of experience. So we looked around at who would be the most appropriate organization to partner. The J&J vaccine was the one that was demonstrating the best prospects for Africa, given Africa's idiosyncrasies, geographic, supply chain, and otherwise. And we got into discussions with J&J. We're able to move very swiftly to concluding a CMO agreement. That was the first step. And I'm very pleased to say that we were able to complete a technology transfer in 5.5 months. That's record-breaking stuff. It's trend-setting, I think, in many respects. It wasn't easy to carry out because you'll all recall that we were in severe lockdowns at that time. And it's not like J&J colleagues could jump on a plane and travel down south and inspect facilities and do audits. So our teams were working 24/7, doing audits with those, those forward cameras that you've got walking around a facility to show what these facilities looked like and to give certainty and assurance around quality, safety, and efficacy of our manufacturing. So it was a very difficult environment, and one that required out-of-the-box thinking and significant innovation. And I'm pleased to say we moved from a CMO relationship into a licensing arrangement. And we should not understate what the CMO relationship achieved, because at the end of all of this, in 12 months, 225 million doses of the J&J vaccine were produced, the majority of which went to Africa. A small portion of that went into Europe. But we did segue, and again, many of the colleagues on this call, including the WTO colleagues, it's a pity, and I'm sure Tony will convey this back to Dr. Ngozi. Those CEO meetings led to a licensing arrangement between Aspen and J&J, and Aspen granted us what was at the time the first COVID-19 vaccine license. Unfortunately, things didn't work out, nothing to do with J&J or Aspen, but the demand died down, and there wasn't sufficient procurement happening out of Gavi and other organizations. That's something that we are working on into the future. I don't want to comment on sustainability. Greg, you said we'll come back to that. But in conclusion, may I say the following, that the experience with J&J demonstrated what is possible when you work collaboratively and in a solution-orientated way. You can transcend many of the boundaries and bottlenecks. And secondly, it delivered the required result because just short of 230 million doses were produced. And lastly, it demonstrated that Africa does have both the competence, expertise, and experience to enter into these relationships and start solving its own problems through partnerships. And nothing solves problems better than local capacity, Greg. And you started off this seminar by saying that borders were shut. And the only way you'll prevent that in future is if we build regional capacities that solve local public health problems. So thanks very much.
Okay, Stavros, I'm not going to repeat all those statements. I hope people made note of them. We'll come back to it. But indeed, an amazing partnership there, and still more we can talk about. I'm going to move over now to Gilead and Ferrosons. Hemal Shah is Director of IP and Trade Policy. And from Ferrosons, we have Osman Khalid Wahid. He's the CEO of Ferrosons. Thank you very much for being able to join us today, Osman, virtually, because I know you're very busy. I should just say we did invite everybody to attend in person, but of course not everybody could. Very busy people on the other sides of the planet. So my first question to Hemal is, could you take us through the development to licensing process, the new novel therapeutic products such as Remdesivir? And as a company, of course, you have a very strong history of voluntary licensing. And again, you were very quick in response to the pandemic.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Greg. And thanks to PMA for putting together this fantastic opportunity to tell our story. So I'd love to share very quickly what I can, our story of 3 years of fighting COVID-19 with Veklury or remdesivir, which became the first COVID-19 treatment approved by the US FDA in October 2020. It's really a story of how intellectual property protections enabled Gilead to provide a really important treatment option when there was nothing else available in the very early days of the pandemic. Clinical trials provided in COVID-19 patients began as early as February of 2020. This was a full month before the WHO actually declared COVID-19 a pandemic. We were able to move so fast because we had worked earlier on, we invested to understand remdesivir's antiviral activity against coronaviruses in general, but also had other safety data from other research programs dating back to as early as 2009. And then it is a story of IP for development. It's also a story of IP-enabled access, partnerships for access and quick action. So I'll just remind everyone quickly that remdesivir is an intravenous drug. So it does warrant multiple levels of redundant controls to assure sterility across vials. So Gilead worked early on to procure a steady flow of very scarce new raw materials. We invested in process manufacturing, process improvements to manufacturing. We halved manufacturing time. We ramped up manufacturing capacity by 100-fold. We did this not only through our internal capacity, but we realized we would have to work with other partners. So we quickly onboarded about 40 other companies across 13 countries around the world to put together what we believed would be the fastest possible arrangement for remdesivir production. And then, again, the proactive investment that we made into diversified supply chains, inserting redundancy and controls in every step of the supply chain to maintain high quality production, as well as ramp up production so that we can prevent shortages even during surge periods. All of this was supported by intellectual property that gave us the legal certainty, as well as the incentive to move really, really quickly. And all of this, by the way, was done before remdesivir received FDA approval in October 2020. Now, to answer the second part of your question, some of these very guiding principles actually informed how we enter into voluntary licensing with our partners in resource-limited countries. So Gilead, as you mentioned, Greg, has an extensive history and experience in voluntary licensing. So we use that very quickly to move quickly. We also we had relationships with so many of these generic drug manufacturers who have their own track record in ramping up, low cost, high volume, high quality medicines for people in developing countries. So we moved quickly. We signed agreements with vetted manufacturers in Pakistan. Feroz Sons, we have the pleasure of Osman joining us today, as well as India and Egypt, and to make remdesivir available to 127 countries. And this list actually includes low and lower middle income countries, as well as upper middle income countries that have significant challenges to healthcare access. The licensees themselves invested at risk before regulatory approval. They reallocated production lines, they procured manufacturing material and equipment. Our licenses also enabled the tech transfer of the manufacturing process, which was really complicated. It took 12 months, we brought it down to 6 months, and then we moved that tech transfer package to our licensees. Our licensees are also enabled to subcontract with any company in any country to make remdesivir production possible. And one important thing I'll mention is that all of our licenses remain royalty-free despite the end of the public health emergency. I am really pleased to note that, to date, Veklury, the branded version, as well as licensed generic remdesivir, have been made available to over 13 million patients over the globe, with over 60% actually in resource-limited developing countries, without a single report of any of our licensees unable to fulfill demand. The US Patent Office actually recognized our work with quick action on remdesivir with a Patents for Humanity Award. And I'll end by saying that, our Gilead, along with our partners and our licensees, have been meeting real-time global demand since October of 2020. So it's been quite a journey, but partnerships have been the center point of everything we've done so far.
Oh, great. Well, I think that's an opportunity for Osman to comment. How did the voluntary nature and the tech transfer within that of the partnership help with the production increase and your relationship with Gilead?
Thank you very much, Greg, and thank you for the invitation. My apologies for not being there in person because of prior travel commitments. But it's really a privilege to be on this panel and to be able to help tell the story of voluntary licensing, which I think is a very, very important story for the public health world. As Hemel mentioned, one of the, I think, extraordinary facts about the Gilead licensing model was the fact that these direct deal agreements with existing trusted partners around the globe allowed Gilead to do the ramp-up, tech transfer, quality control, and manufacturing rollout with breakneck speed. So in our case, I think it was May 6th of 2020 when Gilead first reached out to us. Within a week, we had an agreement. And within 12 weeks of that, we were able to start rolling out product, share information on production and quality control with our partners around the world. And it enabled us to really proactively and in very quick speed respond to requests around the world. I'm really grateful to our partners at Gilead, particularly Clifford Samuel, who began this voluntary license arrangement, and Liz Murray, who was online with me, particularly 24/7, making sure that all information that needed to be shared was shared in real time. And Gilead was doing this with multiple partners. So it was 6 in the beginning, then it ramped up to, I think, 9, and then 11, and possibly 13. I think the other important thing about this model was that it involved competing licensees in multiple geographies. In our case, in terms of capacity, we were probably one of the smallest ones. But as a company, we made a commitment on day one of the partnership that if there was a patient anywhere in the 127 countries who needed treatment, we would make sure that we got them across to them, and we'd pick up the logistics costs and make it up elsewhere in larger orders. This commitment was tested very early on when we received a query from a physician in Costa Rica. They had one patient in the ICU who was in urgent need of treatment. And I'm proud to say that we were able to get this treatment across to that patient within 7 days. And ultimately, although that patient unfortunately did not survive, to this day, we get postcards from their family. And that's the kind of impact that these partnerships can have. During the Delta wave, if you remember, India had to place a temporary restriction on exports because of the large surge of patients domestically. And as you know, India and Pakistan don't have the best in terms of political relationships at the state level. But at the licensee level, we work very closely with our counterparts in India to make sure that if there were any urgent unmet needs in countries that were now were not able to access treatment, we would step in and do this, and so did the partners in Egypt. So I remember two examples of Nepal and the Philippines, where Indian licensees identified these urgent demands to us, and we were able to make sure that the patients in those countries were able to access treatment immediately. And the last thing I'd like to point out is that the competitive nature of the VL model, where all licensees compete with each other in these LMIC countries, also really helped in bringing the cost down. So as production ramped up, as economies of scale were gained, it directly led to a benefit to those countries in terms of the treatment costs coming down dramatically.
Thank you very much. And the point on the competition, something we've not mentioned before, we can go into it. I think, we heard actually from Rasmus that, this is the highest rate of voluntary licensing and tech transfer agreements ever seen, highest rates of risk, the highest rates of production surge. I think we're also seeing actually a record is the speed in which these voluntary licensing and licensing agreements were done, which in my knowledge are also unprecedented. And we're hearing this through the various discussions we're having here. Now, we're going to go on to AstraZeneca. Unfortunately, Marco Krieger from Fiocruz could not join us today, but Paula is here, and Paula is Senior Director, Global Policy and Advocacy at AstraZeneca. And Paula, you essentially, as AstraZeneca, have an end-to-end global partnership, starting with Oxford and then a whole series of voluntary licensing agreements. Maybe you'd like to explain how that developed and what came out from that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Greg. And again, thank you for having us here today. And it's really great to hear from all of our colleagues and share, I think, very similar experiences and challenges in many respects. So really, we started our partnership with Oxford University very early on in the pandemic. Again, that was a partnership that was negotiated very quickly. I think it was about 10 days. And really that partnership was to enable a global development, manufacturing and distribution of the vaccine. We delivered over 3 billion doses. Over 2/3 of those doses went to low and low middle income countries. So equitable access was very a critical component of part of that agreement. And we also agreed to do it on a not-for-profit basis. If you look at the impact of that, there's been data published in the Lancet and also modeling done by Affinity, and we estimate in the first year alone, the vaccine saved over 6 million lives. So it was really a significant effort. If we then think about the other partnerships beyond Oxford, and of course, partnering with Oxford really enabled us to partner with, renowned kind of world vaccinology experts. But then on the manufacturing side, we had over 20 partnerships in over 15 countries. And these really range from contract manufacturing sort of organization partnerships like we've heard before. And there, we worked really intensely day in, day out to optimize and scale up production. But then we had really important voluntary licensing agreements. The pivotal one was, of course, with Serum Institute of India, the world's largest vaccine manufacturer. But then also we had a very important partnership with Fiocruz in Brazil, to enable local development and production in Brazil and more broadly in Latin America. And I think if we look at these sort of partnerships and kind of the things that we were looking at when we were entering, we were really looking for partners who could develop at scale. I mean, we're talking of huge volumes here. They needed to have the capabilities, the facilities, the staff, the resource, the expertise. And, this was at the time of a pandemic. So we couldn't go and visit sites. Everything had to be done remotely. And that added a huge complication to all of it. And then if we think about each of these technology transfers, they were all very unique, even though it's the same vaccine. And maybe one way to illustrate this is you could almost think about the vaccine as a 1,000-page recipe book. And, it's not something you can hand over and, overnight the vaccine kind of magically appears. It requires really intense efforts, as we heard, day in, day out, week in, week out. You look at how do you optimize the process? Where do you get the raw materials? There were interruptions to supply chains. There were trade restrictions. So it required, different circumstances in different places. And then I don't know if that happens to you, but, even if you follow the recipe when you're baking or cooking, you don't always end up with the same result. So here, even though, we would be obviously diligently following the same approach, sometimes the yields are different. This is very complex manufacturing. Things can go sometimes wrong. And as we were operating in a pandemic situation, we didn't have large sort of safety stock or ways to kind of access additional materials. So I think it's just worth to sort of highlight that this was a really unusual environment, I think, for all of us to operate. And we were operating under huge constraints. And I think just a final remark from me really on the regulatory side, I think one thing that really helped us and accelerated access to a vaccine was the WHO EUL approvals for different supply chains. So, that really helped. But then I think Thomas was asking us to think about the challenges. Then on the flip side, we still had many national regulators that did want a lot of additional information and additional quality testing, even though we'd already done up to 60 quality tests, as the supply chain progressed. So I think from our perspective for our future pandemic preparedness, really greater regulatory harmonization and alignment would be something that would support quicker and more equitable access. But think I will leave it at there. I could probably speak about this topic for a very long time, but I will stop there to allow my other colleagues to have time to speak as well.
Yeah, Paula, it's really important. You remind us that this is all done. Obviously it's in response to a pandemic, but you're in a pandemic. You have all these restrictions, you have all these challenges, you have lockdowns, and you're still able to progress. And I think that's really important. The other thing is you stressed also, these tech transfer, you cannot put this on the website, as was once suggested by someone in an interview with Thomas, actually. Why don't you just put this on the website and then everyone can access it? You can't. You've got to actually have the skill sets as the company to take them to the recipient company that has to have the skill sets. And there's that engagement that takes place. That's key. And that's also why many of you did due diligence and kept the pool relatively small, big enough, yeah, but to make sure that you could focus on what you're doing. Which leads me over to Pfizer and BioVac, because I think a number of these points Kilian would like to raise. So I'm really delighted, both online, is Kilian Mullet. He is the Senior Director, Commercial Supply Strategy at Pfizer, was intensely involved on the ground, I know, in the agreement with CEO, with BioVac, and very happy again to have the CEO of BioVac today, Morena Macarona. Really, thank you very much for your time. I know it was difficult for you to be able to come over here, but great. So Kilian, straight on to the question, and really we're switching back a bit here to Africa and vaccines. What are your key takeaways from your partnership with BioVac to manufacture and distribute your COVID-19 vaccine doses within Africa?
Yeah, good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to chat and also to hear lessons learned from my colleagues there. It's heartwarming. So essentially, our main lessons learned working with our partner with BioVac, probably based on three main areas. Historically, we've had dedicated teams working on vaccine transfers globally for the last 20 years at least, right, on all continents practically. We've learned very key important lessons from those experiences, which are learned, the hard way. Essentially, one of the key things that we found is that you need a lot of resources, you need the right people, and you need them both in country, whether that's in South Africa, and you also need them above country, supporting from the outside. So that was number one, right? Having the right people, making them available to support our partner in BioVac. Number two, I guess, is that we've had a partnership with BioVac going back to 2015 for our pneumococcal vaccine. And when we looked at that program, we agreed on a phased approach to tech transfer. And some other speakers have spoken about this, right? Formulation and fill finish is not easy. It's extremely complicated. It takes a lot of time. It takes a huge amount of effort and resources. And I think, any of our colleagues that have spoken on this have sort of touched on those points. So, a phased approach is what we had with our partner BioVac, where we learned as we moved along, we built up capabilities, we built up experiences, how to deal with problems, how to get materials, all these areas that you can only learn by doing. And ultimately, all of those learned experiences in real time is what enabled us to very, very rapidly form our partnership with BioVac. We had contracts in place. We have an absolutely excellent relationship with Dr. Macarona and his entire team. And we could rapidly move to a contract, order equipment at risk, and just drive on like you can do when you have a partnership of this magnitude. So they would be the main points I would mention in terms of how we collaborated. The two areas I think that we would look at, I'm not going to repeat some earlier comments. One was on the regulatory strengthening, right? And I think one of the speakers there from Astra had mentioned this. I think maybe I'd elaborate even further. From our perspective, that expanded African Medicines Agency, which allows for that broader approval within the Africa Union would be extremely helpful and would lead to increased demand potentially through more countries. And I think secondly, I'll just focus specifically on the word demand, because no matter what work Pfizer does with BioVac or our partners do here, any manufacturing facility needs to have demand, sustainable demand of product, right, to cover overhead costs, materials, essentially to run their business. Because making vaccines is complicated and it's expensive, and economy of scale really, really matters. So any more focus on that demand is really, really important to support our partners, and maybe on that I'll let Morena take the reins on that in a couple of moments when he speaks. Thank you, Greg.
Yeah, thanks very much, Kilian. Yeah, there was, when you were talking about sustainability demand, there were a number of heads nodding here, and someone shouted out yes. So obviously, Morena, would you like to take up the points that Kilian's raised and put them into your perspective as the as the CEO of BioVac?
Yes, thank you very much, Greg, and also to my dear friend Kilian. I just want for the audience to know, I think it's probably 10 years now that I've known Kilian, and why I'm mentioning this is that these vaccines don't make themselves. You need people behind the scenes to be able to actually do this, and a fundamental issue that comes around it is trust. So we've been very fortunate, just making an example with Kilian, that he's seen through the journey of BioVac, and we've been there, and more importantly, when it's tough, whilst he deals with the technical people, now and again, he gives me a call and says, Morena, well, I think we have a problem. And that is where the strength of the relationship really gets tested, because you have to undergo those troughs. It's always nice to celebrate all of the rewards, but we know that there are all of these troughs that you go through in this tech transfer. And it's quite important that from a people perspective, that there's trust between companies, and that trust obviously is cemented within the relationship. So I just wanted to mention that I was very happy to be on the podium with Kilian as well, whom I've known for many, many years. It's also, I think, quite important to recognize that, we have two African manufacturers here, being Aspen and ourselves. And I don't think 10 years ago we would have had the opportunity. So on one hand, at least Africa has moved. We've shown some capability. Now, I think we can move faster, but I think we have shown some capability. But I think what is important is that if we take 10 years ago with 2009 H1N1, none of us were ready to absorb technology. But if you fast track, then we were able to at least absorb some element of technology. And for our own company, we're very proud that with Pfizer, we were able to take two of their most complex vaccines, one being Prevnar 2015, and the other one being the COVID-19 with mRNA vaccine. So I think it probably validated a lot of the relationship and what happened behind the scenes. But anyway, coming back to to the fundamental issue is, just to echo what Kilian was talking about, is really sustainability. These are businesses, there are people behind them, and we really need sustainable business going forward. So I think as we look forward, hopefully we would have proven our technical capability, as a continent. I'm not only speaking on BioVac, but hopefully we've proven our technical capability. And I think all we need now is for the market and the ecosystem to really ensure that also Africa has its place. With that, certainty of demand is important. We need our own governments to support us. A lot of the African governments are young democracies. The African Union in itself is fairly young compared to the EU. So with any young organization and with any young democracies, you are going to find blips here and there. Sometimes, as an example, when it comes to local procurement, those are elements that we need to make sure that they are quite, quite clear, so that we can go and get partnerships like we have, and have many more of the BioVacs out there, and the BioVac type of partnership. So I'll pause here, Greg. If there are any questions, I'm happy to pick up on those as well.
Yeah, great. You mentioned two important things: trust and sustainability, which we can continue on. What I'm going to do now is we have a second round of discussions where I want to ask the panelists about what they would see as needed or not needed for the future in order to continue what I think, because generally accepted, a very significant response. I'm having, yes, I know, yeah. So I was going to say, if I was going to finish, yeah, that we're going to do that. So just to be prepared, everyone, that I won't be asking you those individual questions. Yeah, I'll just do one question. Now, before we go into that, I'm delighted to have our representative from the Medicines Patent Pool here today with us. Tiwa is in charge of policy advocacy aspects and the application of voluntary licensing and technology transfer aspects to facilitate access to COVID-19 antivirus. That's quite a long sentence there. Also has a background in the industry himself. Tiwa, what can you tell us about the MPP's model and how your collaborations with different companies, many of them generic that are here, many of the innovators that you have here, and just we agreed on this question because you've actually increased the number of licenses or sub-licensees, as is the normal, by almost a factor of 2.5, yeah? How come you have so many sub-licensees? What was the decision around that? So the model and the number of those sub-licensees.
Thank you very much, Greg, for moderating the session, and also thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting the Medicines Patent Pool. So I'll give a brief overview of Medicines Patent Pool, then I'll go into highlighting the key steps in our work, and I will try to answer the last question that you asked. So MPP works through voluntary licensing and technology transfer to facilitate access to innovative medicines in low and middle income countries. In our 13 years of existence as an organization, we have secured licenses with 20 patent holders. Some of the companies are here, and we have established partnerships with 58 generic manufacturing companies in 16 continents around the world. And our partners have delivered 30 billion doses of treatment and in about 140 countries. So in terms of how we go about our work, we take a public health oriented approach to negotiate and manage non-exclusive and transparent licensing to ensure that products are available and they are affordable in low and middle income countries. So MPP starts its work by actually trying to identify products that have public health significance, to which licensing could facilitate access. So in the case of COVID-19, we did this in partnership, working with partners on the therapeutics pillar of the Act A, access to COVID-19 tools accelerator. So once we identify products, then we engage in negotiations with patent holders. For COVID, our negotiations resulted in the licensing of 3 products. Molnupiravir was licensed by MSD, and that covered 106 countries, low and middle income countries. We also signed a license agreement with Pfizer, covering 95 low and middle income countries for nirmatrelvir, ritonavir. And also we signed an agreement with Shionogi. Shionogi is a Japanese company for license for encitrelvir, and that covers 117 countries. So upon securing license, MPP invites interested manufacturers, generic manufacturers from anywhere in the world to express interest in being sub-licensees. And we do this through an expression of interest process that is blinded to ensure objectivity. And we do this based on certain criteria, most importantly, quality and capacity. So our work does not end with just licensing. We also support product development through regulatory filings as well as working with partners to ensure delivery and uptake at the country level. So the question about number of sub-licensees. So I guess the key issue at the peak of the pandemic was in actually estimating market potential. No one knew the trajectory of the pandemic. So we received about 150 applications for sub-licenses. And so we were faced with whether to give few licenses and risk undersupply with the consequences. Because as at that time, there were millions of cases of COVID, sometimes on a daily basis. We also faced with the choice of maybe giving many licenses and being faced with the potential of having a market that will not be viable. So we decided to give about a quarter, to partner with about a quarter of those that applied that showed that they have the capacity to quickly make products available. So that is why we ended up signing agreements with a number of licensees that were not the usual in MPP's way of working. I think I'll pause it.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, so just bear in mind how many people actually applied for a license, up to 150. That's quite a large number. And thank you for explaining that model. So what I'd like to do now, due to time, I'm simply going to ask one question, all of you, of which the reply is not allowed to be more than 30 seconds. That's why I'm on my phone. I'm getting instructions from the back. So first to Julia, what's your key message for the future? What should be done or not done?
So I think the two messages. One is these partnerships are strong, and I think across all of the discussions today, you've seen that. It's about what we can do to make the partnerships more impactful. There are a lot of public policies that are in place at the multilateral level and at the national level, and that require ongoing conversation to go through the hurdles that they create or to change them if needed to be facilitators. And that means that industry has to be at the table. Companies have to be at the table, not just to be consulted when those policies are put in place, but when those policies are implemented. And whether that is moving quality assurance supplies from one country to the other, moving people from one country to another, or ensuring downstream production or delivery, we must be at the table for these partnerships to be more impactful in the future. I think the second thing that is important is that you have heard that flexibility is critical. Every single supply chain and set of partnerships that you've heard about today, including ours, was bespoke because of what we had in place before COVID and what we could do in COVID. And so as we are having conversations here in Geneva and elsewhere, we need to ensure that that flexibility remains so that we can create impact in a future pandemic.
Great, yeah, flexibility. Yeah, I'm going to ask Vignesh first, who's still online. So I'll take also from there. In 30 seconds, what's your key message for the future?
Sure. So what really worked and what should be the path forward probably from our side should be the early partnership where we engage with the licensors at a very early stage. What this would do is because of the early engagement, it can also happen that we propose a few changes which would make the product viable in the LMICs and the LDCs and the other part of the developing nations. Obviously, with the support of the licensor, these are possible. So this is something that should happen in the future, be it a pandemic or not. What can we do better is basically from an industry standpoint, have much more collaboration with the government or the MOH organizations of the respective countries, where we have certain approvals being expedited with certain risk reward issues being managed, especially in terms of the pandemic. So yeah, this is in short, quick, within your time frame of 30 seconds, what should work and what we have to improve from an industry perspective.
Great, early collaboration and the governments making sure we dialogue with them and they play their part. Okay, so moving on, Lisha. Yeah.
Apologies. Apart from the collaborations across companies with our partners, with our various suppliers, etc., I think we also need to think about innovation on the uptake side. So I think making vaccines and multiples of them was a fantastic achievement, but I think we need to turn them into vaccinations. So I think the next kind of focus needs to be on how do we ensure that that happens at a local level as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Stavros, I'll keep you to 30 seconds.
Yeah.
I know you can do it.
3 simple 30-second messages, right? First of all, we can only achieve global peace and security if we have health security. That means leaving no continent or region behind. And we can only achieve that if there is sustainable demand and the global procurement mechanics are reorientated to enable regional sustainability and procurement. Thanks very much. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you, Stavros. A great call there, I think, for geographical distribution and also for the need for clear uptake on the ground. Okay, so if I could ask Emma.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. So I would say, how can we make partnerships, whether it's private-private or public-private partnerships, how can we set them up for greater success? We know they worked really well, but we had certain issues, delayed regulatory approvals, so regulatory barriers that led to the appearance of counterfeit medicines in some supply chains. We obviously worked with the WHO, with local enforcement agencies to remove those medicines, the counterfeit medicines from supply chains. How do we strengthen health systems so that our partners are better able to reach patients in the last mile? Some countries don't have a system for procurement in place. And then trade restrictions and supply chain bottlenecks. How do we solve for them so that we can work, we can be more aligned, we can talk to each other? India's Delta variant surge basically resulted in a short supply of an important component, but we quickly stepped in, worked with our licensees, onboarded extra manufacturers, and then our Pakistan and Egypt licensees could step in and make sure production was undisrupted for the rest of the other countries. So really appreciate the open communication with the Indian government here as well. So, open communication, partnership, how do we set them up for greater success?
Okay, great. Osman?
Thank you, Greg. I'd just like to underscore that voluntary licensing allows innovators to ensure robust technology transfer and to ring-fence important areas such as quality, pharmacovigilance, and as Hemel mentioned, take strong anti-counterfeit measures. I think that was a critical success story as part of the pandemic. And what I'd request everybody to take away from today's exercise is really, I think every speaker mentioned, trust is key to this entire, to any response, but particularly in a pandemic, it becomes really critical. And we spoke of trust between licensors and licensees, but a similar level of trust we all need to work together to develop between regulators and regulatees, between multilaterals, between governments and NGOs. We're all in this for exactly the same purpose. We have the same ambitions, which is to reach as many patients as quickly and as safely as possible.
Right. So we've got flexibility, we've got sustainability, we've got trust. Over to yourself.
I think my esteemed colleagues have said everything really by now. But yeah, absolutely would echo the need for flexibility, continue to elevate the impact of the partnerships, continue to ensure that we have the right public policies to support this type of work. I think, perhaps that greater regulatory alignment, harmonization as well can really support and accelerate access. So I think I will leave it at that.
Okay, so I'll add regulatory harmonization to that list. So it's still online. Is Kilian?
Yeah, 30-second rule. So 2 very quick ones. I would say don't limit global partners' ability to innovate, right? When you have crisis like this, have as much flexibility as possible for people to innovate in terms of the business model, partnerships, etc. That's number 1. And number 2, I would say, back to the topic of today's conversation, right, is to really focus on voluntary, flexible partnerships that allow, companies and governments to essentially rapidly scale up and scale out production, right, to get products to patients, as I think some of our colleagues have said. That's it, Greg. Thank you.
Thanks, Kilian. Morena.
Thank you. I think in order for us to have this conversation after the next pandemic, we would need for the likes of Africa to not be the last to receive, in this case, vaccines. For that, the next frontier for African manufacturers is to get into drug substance. But before you get into drug substance, you have to excel at even the likes of formulation for finish. Now, for you to excel, you also need an ecosystem that would support you in your day-to-day business. And that ecosystem means we need predictable demand. We need to have global organizations working with us. We need our local governments to support us so that we can go into the next frontier of drug substance. In that way, hopefully we can be able to respond fully to the next pandemic by being end-to-end manufacturers. But it does require an ecosystem to make sure that we are sustainable today in between pandemics. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, the importance of the ecosystem is something, by the way, we released as a European African Business and Forum joint declaration last year, was the importance of that ecosystem. So last but not least, Tiwa, your message.
Yes, thanks. So the process from licensing through regulatory filing, in our experience, happened in record time. It took 1 year from the time that the originator product was granted approval to the time the first generic got regulatory approval to happen. So 1 year. That is unprecedented. Traditionally, it takes 3 to 4 years. So the question is, can we make it to happen sooner? I think we can, and it is possible. So in reinforcing the point made earlier about early licensing, we need to set up systems and processes or mechanisms that will enable licensing to happen much earlier, maybe even through phase 1 clinical trials or even earlier, so that we can shorten the time in future pandemics. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. We do actually, I've been told, we are allowed to have a short series of questions from the floor, and there's some questions that have come in before we have lunch. So if people want to raise your hands, we want to give questions, so I get a bit of an idea of how many we've got. Okay, there's not so many. Okay, gentleman over there, your question, and I take the two together and then add them to this. So.
It is a mystery to me why in large chunks of northern and western industries, it was able for the South to develop counter industries and even to make the traditional centers of production broke, like in the textile industry, the automotive industry, the optical industry, name it, you have it. But in the pharma industry, and it is an old industry, 1 to 2 centuries old, it is still not the case, and we still have to hold some kind of religious rites, asking God to save Africa from the, let's say, monopoly of northern industries.
Okay, I think I get the question that might be in there. Okay. There's a lady at the back there. Okay. Very quick question, yeah, because I got to put them all together.
Public-private partnerships, Europe. I'd like to go back to Anthony's comment about the elephant in the room. I think I've heard a lot of tiptoeing around the elephant on equity, but I'm impressed by everything that you're demonstrating. But in order to build trust, you also need to build a transparent system. There's a lack of transparency. It hasn't been mentioned in your comments. And we know how to do that. We've done it before. So I think to build trust, equity, you will need to focus more on a transparent mechanism, having the private sector in the room.
Okay, and question, lady. Okay, and then I take them. Yeah.
Thank you. Nina Larson with AFP. I'm a journalist. I was wondering if you could say something about the pandemic treaty that's being negotiated and your thoughts around your hopes and fears, I guess, for what might or might not be included and how that could impact this. Thank you.
I'll take the last question.
Hi, this is Preeti Patnaik from Geneva Health Files. There's a lot of emphasis on voluntary licensing approaches in the current discussions for a pandemic treaty. Would the industry be comfortable with obligations on voluntary licensing, assuming that something like this can be codified in a pandemic treaty?
Okay. Yeah. If it's obligatory, it doesn't sound very voluntary. I have got some questions around here about whether I think it's already been answered though, whether the royalties now how will they now work in the pandemic? Yeah, are they royalty free? And also, why did CTAP not work? And had anybody considered working with CDAP? I know Thomas would like to answer some of the questions that were raised from the floor. I just want to say that in the case of Africa, I mean, as you hear from African partners, there is a lot of work that is being done in Africa by African companies themselves, by the African CDC, by the PAVM that works with the African CDC. There's the move by AMA, and I think Africa has moved a long way forward. A number of the companies are working together with African colleagues as well to do that. And I think there is a very big business-to-business approach on the African continent that moves away from what may have been a more colonialist thinking that you were mentioning. That's going to be my only comment. Before I ask Thomas, does anyone want to pick up any of the points that were raised? Otherwise, we can go straight over to Thomas. No, fine. Thomas, would you like to comment on some of those points? Yeah.
I think I can
and
lead the umbrella.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you can conclude the day. Yeah.
No, basically, CTAP I can be extremely short. There's no demand and no need for CTAP because MPP existed. Companies did rely on multiple partnerships built up over years. I think what we heard from all, the partners, the licensees, was we knew each other, we trusted each other, and I've heard more than once. Our concern was actually unlicensed, substandard, low quality, counterfeit. And that, I think, explains a lot in terms of where the problem is. In terms, of course, of differentiation, what I personally saw over the last 3 years in the vaccines, it was B2B bilateral. And no disrespect to WTO, but let's say last June's statement was pretty irrelevant, purely symbolic in the vaccines field. We haven't seen any impact of that. I think it potentially could have damaged, but the companies work together. They did. I think that's in terms of pandemic treaty. Now, voluntary involves know-how sharing, tech transfer, working together on clinical trials, on getting, the skilled workforce and getting everything right. For me, one of the most shocking news recently was that, price was the only determinant, killing a partnership which had been built up over 10 years. And I think what happened to BioVac there with the, pneumococcal vaccine has potentially done a lot of damage for multiple efforts in terms of building up local manufacturing. And I think whether it's Morena, whether it's Stavros or others, we need sustainability there. In terms of pandemic treaty, I think was the AFP, learnings we saw from the last 3 years was innovation delivered, access to pathogens was unhindered, and partnerships worked, partnerships voluntary. I've heard this word voluntary multiple times from every speaker this morning. And voluntary means you cannot be coerced. Now, me being industry, if industry would not have done what it did, what we heard, and Seth Barclay has said that more than once, then the debate would be different. Because industry did what I think everybody expected it to do. If that would not have happened, I think it would be a different dialogue. In terms of pandemic treaty, I have to admit I'm deeply concerned. The zero draft is potentially undermining innovation. The zero draft potentially compromise is something which was unquestioned now, immediate access unhindered to pathogens for the benefit of the global public good, namely vaccination, treatment, whatever. And therefore, we really need to focus on what was also said, we need to do better on equity. And there we need to sit down and talk, how can we improve that? But I think we need to draw on the experience, multi-stakeholder partnerships across the board, doing what's not business as usual, but already pre-pandemic, prepare for that. I am really deeply encouraged. I see many companies are involved in the Intrepid coalition on more antiviral research. I know companies who are really engaging with CEPI, for example, on prototype vaccine development for pathogens not yet pandemic. I see companies really working, how can we move, and regulatory agencies, how can we move towards the 100-day mission? We had 326 days, which was 5 times faster than the fastest vaccine ever developed. I think we really need to focus on what didn't work, and we really need to maintain these partnerships. And we need to be open and build trust. You cannot coerce voluntary, but you can't coerce people trusting you. And I think trust is developing over time, as we have heard from our partners online and here around here. But I must say, I was a little bit afraid. We had such a packed meeting online and in the room on a warm summer day in Geneva. The audience was so patient. I think you all deserve now the standing luncheon and the chatters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Okay, I'll wrap up now. Just key terms: flexibility, trust, sustainability, harmonization, and working on experience. So I think we can take those home. Just a round of applause for our panel, both here and online. Thank you.